Hey, hello, hi, welcome back to another voiceover edition. So last video, we were talking about the new economic policy and war communism that had come before it in the USSR. And we ended the video pretty much right as we were hitting the beginning of the 5-year plans under Stalin. And for the purposes of this, I have decided to focus primarily on the first 3 of the 5-year plans, though it should be noted that they continued on like well beyond this point. But that is what I decided to focus on. So if you are ready, without further ado, buckle in. In 1929, Stalin wrote and published the article, A Year of Great Change, wherein he touted the achievements of the previous year, a year of advanced industrialization. The abandonment of the NEP in favor of his 5-year plans resulted in the establishment of 3 primary institutions that defined the Soviet economic system: soft budget constraints, 5-year plans, and collectivized agriculture. Unlike the preceding economic policy, guidelines were discarded and directives were enforced. 5-year plans were developed as projected economic growth, wherein directives were enacted to achieve that growth. Minimum outputs were declared primarily in the form of target weights. Price setting had previously been employed by the NEP, but the 5-year plans increased the government's reach in controlling all markets. Profits were no longer the primary goal for industry or agriculture. Therefore, negative profits, as investments were required for growth and development, were expected and not penalized. Thus, soft budget constraints became a staple in the industrial organization of the USSR. Each 5-year plan saw an increase in targets for production, despite not reaching any of the targets in any of the first 5 years. And rather than reflecting production or utility, these targets acted as motivational tools to increase output. Initially, this was to the benefit of the Soviet economy. Production in many material industries was doubled in the second 5-year plan, and by 1934, some targets were being actually met. However, by the third 5-year plan, production began to stall. This was primarily due to the hallmark disorganization that had plagued the Soviet economy since its inception. Labor was regularly misappropriated, and soft budget constraints allowed for the overhiring of workers regardless of productive output. Targets were raised, seemingly arbitrarily, being raised as soon as production appeared to be approaching the desired outputs, or lowered if it became apparent that the target was impossible to meet. Unfortunately for the Soviet industrial growth goals, the lowering and rising of targets led managers to, quote, build up reserves of labor, equipment, and materials to meet higher future targets without strain, end quote. Investment in machinery and other trappings of industrialization remained the priority throughout the 1930s, with heavy machinery being the primary investment percentage to the detriment of many quality of life sectors, including housing and social services. This rapid and hefty investment scheme resulted in a distinctive increase in capital stock. By the late 1930s, in less than 10 years, the USSR had achieved its long-desired industrial revolution. However, this investment and development scheme could not be continued without sacrifices on the part of the population. In the agricultural sector, by mid-1930, quote, thousands of peasant households quit the collectives, and the fraction collectivized dropped from just below 60% to below 1/4, end quote. Kulaks became the target of class liquidation, with some being sent to concentration camps, some deported, and some relocated to the least arable land. All 3 categories of punishments resulted in the displacement of their families, and many were killed. The mass exodus of the peasants from the collectives was put to a halt quickly, and by 1933, approximately 75% of all peasants were forced to return. Peasant revolts took many forms, with the most infamous being the slaughter of their livestock, which Stalin took as an act of war. In response, the state maintained their production quotas despite the fall in grain production, resulting in famine in places within the USSR where grain was the primary focus of their agricultural efforts, such as in Ukraine. Many peasants migrated to cities, exacerbating the strain on the social systems and impacting output negatively in the agricultural sector. An attempt to staunch the outflow included the requirement of passports to move about the country, with increasing restrictions placed on who could move about and when, including the restriction of even day trips. Like, can you even imagine you can't go to the next town over without being stamped out and stamped in, being allowed to? Like, Anyway, an additional strain on the peasant population was food prices. Between the first and third 5-year plans, food prices increased by nearly 800%, and despite output by the farmers matching the rate of inflation, the farmers took home less and less of the profits, as much of it was taxed. This tax financed the investment into industry, impacting the rural and urban peasants alike. Cities were overwhelmed with a population that grew faster than they could build domiciles. Overemployment in the cities ironically reduced productivity, and dwindling populations mixed with the lack of incentive to develop or maintain any of the newly employed technologies, because most of this machinery was introduced in the 1930s, also resulted in lower productivity in agriculture. Had the Second World War not interrupted the third five-year plan, it is plausible that the country would have run itself back into the ground. This did not, however, put a true halt on the multi-year plans, as they continued in various formats and lengths throughout the end of the Soviet Union, like I said at the beginning of the video. The thought experiment now is, which policy might have served the USSR best? It is undeniable that wartime communism was doomed to be short-lived. Investment was impossible, and without investment, no development could be encouraged or even had. Therefore, the policy as a whole can be dismissed. What then of the early five-year plans or the new economic policy that had preceded them? It is apparent that the initial five-year plans saw tremendous growth in the development of the industrial sector. The initial seizure of grain allowed the country to redistribute its stores to feed urbanites, who were the primary players in industrializing the country. However, as was discussed here, the impressive growth rate deteriorated almost as quickly as it had accelerated. It would be remiss to ignore the fact that the USSR achieved the hallmarks of an industrial revolution in the first two five-year plans. Quote, Sir Arthur Lewis, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, observed that an industrial revolution required that the investment rate raised from 5% to 10% or more, end quote. This threshold was met and then crossed in the early 1930s. However, the investment rate was so concentrated on heavy industry and transportation that the other sectors deteriorated significantly, ultimately resulting in stagnation in growth and development in agriculture, light and heavy industries, and population management, which is like quality of life, social services, etc. It is apparent that had World War II not interrupted later five-year plans, the existing trend of raising the targets without providing any concessions would not have resulted in any further economic growth. So if the early five-year plans are not the answer, what about the NEP? Would the USSR have achieved industrialization under Lenin's policies, or was it also predestined to end when it did? I argue that industrialization would have been met, but at a much slower pace. Despite the teeth gnashing exhibited by Stalin, the economic growth rate was no slower than other developing countries of that period. However, disorganization, poor crop yields, and the overall focus on agriculture without investment, in turn into heavy and light industries, would have resulted in a much slower pace of development. It is likely that the country would have had a higher potential to embrace capitalism had it been allowed to continue for the generation or more that was called for by anti-Stalin members of the Central Party. However, due to the ideological dissonance that this would have caused, capitalism is the exact opposite of Marxist communism. This might have led the Soviets to a dissolution at a much faster rate than what actually occurred. Or perhaps they might have simply ebbed slowly towards a change in ideologies as the revolutionaries who brought about the Soviets' rise to power grew old and died. The truth of the matter is that humanity will never truly know. All three economic policies planted the seeds for the USSR's ultimate downfall, as all three shared one distinct hallmark that plagued the government from its inception: reactionary measures exacerbated by disorganization. But all of the three, the prize of the steadiest growth rate and lowest rate of peasant revolutions, for what industry can be built without the people to build it, is the NEP. Thank you all for joining me on this two-parter, you guys. I know this one was much shorter. I'm sure that you are happy. For whatever reason, despite the fact that I tend to find the readings kind of boring, I keep gravitating towards economic history so dang much. It's freaking insane. So if you guys have any good theories as to why that might be, let me know, because I am at a total loss. Anyway, if you like this content, please consider leaving a like, and if you enjoy history in both long and short-ish format, consider subscribing as well. I mean, it's free, which is pretty rad, and I would certainly appreciate it. At the end of the video, there's going to be some links to my playlist of other touch of history videos, basically just video essays talking about history things, as well as suggestion for a video that YouTube thinks that you might like. Thank you all again for joining me. Please keep the conversation going in the comments, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye! This tax financed the investment into industry, impacting the rural.